Hello and welcome to Plow and Potato. I'm Sean Bonet.
I'm Joffrey Swait.
We are coming to you high above Moscow here in the Spud Pub.
Welcome to the Big Show.
And this big show is extra big. You know why?
Why? You know my nickname is Big Show?
No, it's not. That's like a wrestler, isn't it?
Exactly. From the Carolinas. And as a rugby player in South Carolina, people would call me Big Show. It's one of my many awesome nicknames.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. Oh, I thought you were just like making something up.
No, man.
You're trying to be cool.
Anyway, go. See, that's so you haven't realized yet. I am cool.
Okay.
Go on.
You are cool. Well, anytime a big show is special and cool is when we're bringing someone in. You know, we're all about community, establishing and building it, doing things together, talking together. And anytime we can bring in super expert guests, it's awesome. And today, we've got Jesse Sumpter.
Super expert.
Jesse Sumpter is an online teacher, a Christian online teacher. Just so everyone knows, if your kids are in the government schools, bad. This is why society is declining. And for more, just look at, there's so many great resources. So if you don't know that, then just here's your intro.
We're both teachers.
And Christian teachers.
Yeah. And Jesse's our elder.
Yes, he is.
So he's younger than I, but he is our ecclesiastical elder.
He elds over us.
Yes, at Christ Church.
So he's a teacher, and he wrote on Abraham Kuyper.
On Abraham Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism, which is a topic that's pretty dear to your heart.
It is dear to my heart. Yeah, so I did my master's thesis on Calvin and the Psalms and whatnot, so there's a lot of overlap and intersect. So I'm going to interview Jesse, and we're going to have a blast.
So without further ado.
And who is this Abraham Kuyper guy? We're throwing around like he's high business.
Yeah. Well, he is. He's high business. Yeah, definitely expensive, right?
That's right.
Well, actually, I mean, he's a key Reformed Dutch theologian. He's also a politician. So he lived about 1830 to about 1920, and he's in the Netherlands there. He's actually Prime Minister of the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905. So pretty fantastic there. He had other political things he was doing as well. He also helps start a reforming movement in the church there in the Netherlands. And so he's important. And then he comes to America. So the lectures he gives here, lectures on Calvinism, he gives them at Princeton for the Stone Lectures there. That's in 1898. So that's before Princeton goes sideways with Machen later on, and Machen has to bail. But so they invited Kuyper, and he gives a series of lectures there. So he's really important, and even his it's fascinating. His opponents, his enemies, that he made a lot of enemies during his time. They referred to him as an opponent with 10 heads and 100 hands, and so they thought he was definitely a formidable enemy of sorts, an opponent that way, that they recognized he was just vast knowledge, right? He dabbled in all sorts of things, just well read, and just a polymath of a figure. So
yeah, that kind of sounds like a compliment from his enemies.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely.
Like if I could receive such a kind word.
Yeah.
Now, why? So you're trying to bring people in to the way of Kuyper some more, see him as an awesome theologian. Why focus on these lectures? Because it's lectures put into book, famous work. Why go here and not just do, hey, here's Kuyper at large?
Yeah, well, this is how I got into Kuyper, and I mean, he's written so much that I've only really scratched the surface with the lectures. I've dabbled in a few other little things here and there, but not much. I mean, there's a lot out there. There's a whole series of his works that you can get your hands on. You can just Google it, and I haven't even gotten to those yet. So this is where I started, and I thought, well, this is a good way to bring people in. And he covers a variety of topics, so it's a great introduction to his thought as well. So you're covering theology and science and art and all these other topics that way, and politics. And so it's an easy way to get into some of his thoughts there. It's also toward the end of his life, and so I think it's pretty mature. I mean, it's not toward too far. I mean, it's like he still lives another 25 years after this, but it's pretty mature in terms of his thinking. So it's a good sample that way. So if somebody was saying, hey, how do I get into Kuyper? Well, here you go. Read his lectures.
And so you open up, with this Calvinism, a life system. So there's 6 lectures he's given, and it's like you're seeing this idea of Calvinism as a life system is almost really fundamental, foundational behind it all. What does that even mean? Why should we receive Calvinism as a life system?
Yeah, so what Kuyper's doing here is he's taking Calvinism, so John Calvin in the 1500s there with the Reformation in Geneva, and Kuyper is in that tradition, but Kuyper's sort of updating and kind of expanding it. So he's taking Calvinism, we often think of as talking about ecclesiology or talking about salvation, think of the discussion on soteriology and things like that, and God's sovereignty. And Kuyper's taking that and he's saying, okay, let's actually apply this then to really practical, down-to-earth issues. And in many ways, Kuyper, gives us a gas pedal so we can actually step on the gas and apply these things and hit the road and see where it touches. And so what Kuyper's doing here then is considering how Calvinism applies then, so, and particularly God's sovereignty. So that's Kuyper's famous for his line about how there's not one square inch of all of the world that Christ doesn't say mine over, and so that's God's sovereignty in all the world. And Kuyper is big on that theme, and here you see him applying it then to, what does that mean if Jesus is king? What does that mean for church? What does that mean for science? What does that mean for politics? And so that's what he's doing.
I like what I really like about this book is that your voice as a Christian comes through. Sometimes you can read theological works, and especially if they're coming from a liberal perspective, it's almost like they're trying to just like take these weird shots along the way. It's like, but now we're better enlightened. But you're sort of almost running alongside him as a disciple, and it's all very concise and accessible, and so that's what I think is just the real strength of this book.
Yeah.
So let's make this a little teaser. Let's kind of jump through each of these lectures that you've written chapters on, and like what's the point? What's neat and interesting? So let's see, beginning with Calvinism and religion, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's a couple of other prior things that I would give that I talk about in the introduction there to Kuyper, with thinking about sphere sovereignty would also be another big one, big thing that he hints at in different ways in the lecture. So let me backtrack to that, and then I'll jump into the religion one, where with the sphere sovereignty idea, where Kuyper says, well, that, there are certain governments that God has set up in the world, and there are three primary ones. And this is where actually there's sort of a discussion in the Kuyperian world about how many how many spheres are there actually in terms of sphere sovereignty, and some will talk about.
What does the Venn diagram look like exactly?
Yeah, and they'll do things, and I think it's actually unhelpful. So the way that you'll see like graphs, if you Google it, you'll see you have sphere sovereignty, and you'll have like every sphere you could possibly imagine. You've got the family, you've got education, you've got art, you've got science, you've got government, all this. And it's like, and you end up with a bazillion of them, and it's like let's just cut to the chase. I think there's three of them, and I think the three are primary that Kuyper's talking about. It's the church, it's the state or the civil magistrate, and it's the family. It's those three, and everything else falls under those in some way.
Tinier circles.
Like
pimples
those
on the head.
Yeah, and I think it's more biblical to start there, because those are the ones that God actually explicitly sets up in the Bible. You have the family in Genesis, where the family is there caring for the health of the family, reproduction, education. All those things, and then you have the civil magistrate is set up later on, and you've got them, and particularly explicitly, they've got the sword for punishing evildoers and those things, and then you have the church set up, established as preaching the word and dealing with the sacraments, and that the three, it simplifies things in a way that if you try to have like a sphere for education, a sphere for art or whatever, it just gets messy and confusing. Then like whose sphere are you talking about?
That's right.
Right.
Well, and you're seeing this idea of sphere sovereignty as articulated by him is really necessary to dive into some of the smaller spheres that he digs into.
Yeah. Well, and then the other issue. So then let's go back to religion then. So Calvinism, religion, what's going on there? Well, there he's talking about the church. What does the church look like? And that's what he's looking at there. And so he works through that, and the key ideas in that chapter are that, this is where he's applying then the idea of God's sovereignty, where God saves us as individuals, and that we are then saved into a church community, into the body of Christ. But there's nobody that's standing between us and God, like in the Roman Catholic tradition, where you've got some sort of priest that's I have to go confess to the priest, and then he sort of gives me access to Jesus. And and this is the issue that Luther had in the Reformation, where he wasn't sure if he was saved or not, or had confessed all of his sins or not, because he hadn't listed all of them out to the priest. Right? Am I forgiven of everything if I don't list every sin out? And so he actually go back to the priest, like regularly, like 4 and 5 times in a day, and be like, oh yeah, I forgot this one.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I also did this, and oh, I there was one time I stole cookies from my mom, and, like that sort of thing. And the priest eventually gets fed up with Luther and says, Luther, God's not angry with you, you're angry with God, you know that? And Luther's like, what? And so, but that you have to have the priest there, that's the idea. But the Kuyper, though, and Calvin and Luther would say, no, actually, the teaching is that we have one mediator, that's Jesus, and we have direct access. So we always live, the Latin phrase that Kuyper uses is coram Deo. We always live in the presence of God as Christians. Yeah. And so we're before God, so as individuals, we're right there before God. There's nobody who's acting as mediator between us. It's always Jesus directly. And from there, he says that then is the foundation for, or one of the key foundations for religion. The other one then is that religion is always for God, right? That's the purpose. It's not for us. It's not for how I feel. It's not for what I think how it should meet my needs. It's always for God and God's glory, and then that orients everything else. Now, our salvation is a part of that, but we're always called to worship Him and focus on Him. And so that's the element of the chapter on religion then.
Yeah, I really liked your phrase of, you could see Kuyper as giving a little gas pedal to everything that Calvin and his contemporaries were working out. It seems like then in this first go-around on his talk on religion, do you see him doing anything new, or just like saying, this is my foundation, like we need to remember that we're here, we've got enemies rising up now? So was he just trying to remind and reset, or was he doing something more that was more accelerated?
Yeah, he's not being innovative, but I mean that's the great reality though about looking back at the past, at theologians of the past like Calvin, and bringing them into contemporary times, or Kuyper's bringing it into his own time, that it actually makes it fresh though as you apply it to contemporary situations. So he's not inventing anything or making anything new. It's maybe the application of it that's maybe new, but he's just taking old truths that have been there and he's just applying it then. So I don't think it's really new, but the way he's applying it though is fresh and insightful and helpful for that.
Well,
day.
you make a great observation somewhere towards the beginning that he was battling and identifying the modern worldview and modernist as sort of corrupting and deteriorating the church. And so when you have that context of, hey, even just like the greatness of the Netherlands from which he's from, and the Dutch Reformed Church and the strength there, it's like, well, how does something that's built on such strength and faithfulness get weak? And many reasons, but he's kind of coming around and saying, hey guys, remember, like let's return in that way, and don't forget that God is like the one who for religion is for. And picking up on the modernist idea there, I mean, so he's battling, and he sees in a very prophetic way, he sees the end goal of modernism then, right, where he recognized that in 1890s. He says, man, guys, we got to watch for this. I mean, he recognizes, there's a quote in the book where he says that the end of modernism, modernism won't be satisfied until it has made everything the same, everything equal, egalitarianism, such that you get to the place where man is woman and woman is man. He actually says that like right there, and it's like, whoa, like, I mean, we're actually, that's where we are, right? Where you can have a man be a woman and a woman be a man. It's like, what is going on here? This is crazy. But Kuyper saw that 100 years ago. He knew that was where it was going. And I think it's because he saw, again, back to the idea of the life system and worldview, is that it's not that we live in this kind of neutral world where you have Christians with their view of the neutral world, and then you have the non-Christian secular world and worldview, and they're kind of like just kind of floating in the abstract, where he says, no, actually, these issues, they all encompass all of the world, and they actually are directly contradictory to each other, and we need to recognize that. And he says that's why he's interested in this worldview idea and the life system. He uses that term because he says we have to actually meet them at every point and explain everything, right? It's only in the ability to actually see that, okay, this is an erroneous worldview, the secular, modernist, materialistic, evolutionary worldview. It has, in order to deal with them, we have to be able to answer them at every point, on every level, whether it's dealing with science or art or any of these other issues that we have to be able to answer them as a Christian
with a solid integrated worldview.
Yeah.
And that's what he's excited
yeah,
and
interested
interested
about.
about.
Out in the beginning that he's all about pressing the antithesis, pressing each point and getting into it.
Yeah.
And one other plug that I have for this book is not only is it, it's straight, it's concise, accessible, but one thing I'm always, mildly frustrated about is when people dash out all of these quotes from these great people, like, well, Calvin said, and Luther said, and Kuyper said, and you're like, where? Where did he say that? And you say something about, like, you do really well at tracing them back, like, what edition, what page, and so you can go and really just take up that ad fontes spirit, and so just hats off to you there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Well, that was one of my goals. I mentioned this in the introduction, where I want Kuyper to be speaking directly to the reader as much as possible. So I give fairly lengthy quotes from Kuyper there, and I add my own commentary, of course, but I want people to actually be reading Kuyper.
Yeah. And his second lecture, Politics, is very relevant for today, where getting arrested, getting fined is not the Christian way, as Jesus and Paul and Peter, the outlaws, can lay out for us. So what should the 21st century Christian, facing really new and extreme pressures from their politicians and governments, what sort of advice and wisdom are they getting from Kuyper in his talk on politics?
Yeah, and Kuyper here recognizes, again, with God's sovereignty over all the world, that Jesus is king over politics, then that gives us a reason to be engaged in politics. So, and there are two traditions in Western culture, basically since the Reformation, that have tried to deal with politics in different ways. So you have the Roman Catholics during Luther's time and Calvin's time, where you have this intermingling of the church and the emperor or the king, and it gets so confusing that these things get blended together, where you actually have the Pope, and this is still the case today for Roman Catholics. You have the Pope who has an army, that he can actually call his army. It's his bodyguard now. It's actually really fascinating. It's the Swiss army that he has. They have really funny hats and clothes and stuff. It's really hilarious. You can look up. And but he has an army, and he can actually command them to go fight. And the last time that the Pope did that was, I think it was in World War II. Actually, there was a skirmish that they were a part of, and he's like, "Yeah, go fight." Like, whoa, that's crazy. And that just seems so foreign to us, because we're downstream from the Reformation. We recognize that's weird. That you're actually
church army,
what?
Church militia.
Yeah. It's like, what's going on there? I talk with my students about that, saying, hey,
there has to be a Bible verse against that, right?
Yeah. And I tell them, would it be weird if your pastor had an army, a little militia that he gets to call up, and here we go. And it's like, wow, that's wild. So that was one view, but that's very convoluted and confused, where you're actually confusing the sphere of sovereignty there. You're confusing those governments, where the church doesn't, it has a sword, but it's a spiritual sword. It's not the physical sword. The physical sword is actually for the civil government. And so you got to keep those things distinct. So that's one view, where you actually have them blended together. And then the other view then, which is coming out of what I call the radical Reformation, is the Anabaptist view. And Kuyper addresses that in the book as well, where the Anabaptists, and this is not Baptist, this is Anabaptists are like modern day Amish or Mennonites, where they pull away from all civil engagement, such that they have little buggies and maybe one telephone or something like that. If they're
great cheese.
Yeah, and churning and
the longest dresses you've ever seen in your life.
And those people, again, I think they're maybe they mean well, and they're peaceful. Seem maybe God-fearing people in some ways, but there's some weirdnesses there where Kuyper says, no, actually they're pulling away. And it's funny, they've actually created a kind of monastic community then. They're actually pulled away from, and then in fact they get to so far where they, no civil government, no voting, no engagement in the civil sphere, no army, working in the military, no, you can't be a soldier, right?
I'd be curious, what would you rather have people pull away, if we had to choose, like the Amish, or people pull away more like the Christian who's just sort of washed out and hollowed by secularism? Where there's like, well, we're not going to engage because I don't think we really should.
No, I think with Kuyper he'd say no, like that's not helpful. Like to disengage and pull away like that, I think that's an abuse actually of Scripture, where we are called to be radical in how we live. We are called to be faithful in how we live, but we're called to do that in the callings He's given us. And one of those callings is in the civil realm, mayor and police and city council and governor and all the way up. And that's important. And if we pull away, the problem with pulling away, and this is the thing that the Anabaptists don't deal with, is if you pull away, the issue then is, well, you only end up with ungodly people who are leading our country. And it's like, how can that be helpful? Yeah. So you're supporting abortion then? You want everyone to all the politicians who want abortion to be like, how does that help? Like that seems actually contrary to the gospel then. We actually want to reform and bring reformation to the civil magistrate. And in order to do that, you actually have to have Christians in the government then.
Well, in one area that I think Christians are, especially, it's so funny how 2020 brings so many things to bear right in our face. Yeah. Mm-hmm. One thing that we're so quick to pull out of and sort of defer to experts is in the way of science and medicine. And Kuyper addresses like how Christians, especially Calvinist people, should talk about science. So how do we then take that idea of engaging with government, politics, culture, then in the realm of science, where it's like, but we're not experts, Jesse.
So jumping to the science chapter, then I think that's what you're leading there too, and that's where it's fascinating. So he actually unpacks in that lecture. He actually talks about how you have what he terms the naturalist and the super. Well, he used the normalist. I think it's normalist and abnormalist, and how he describes the way we view the material world. Mm-hmm. And we have these worldviews. So you have scientists, basically a materialistic worldview on the one side, the secularist worldview, and then you have the Christian or spiritualist worldview. We recognize that there's something deeper than just the material world. And he says those two worldviews are actually directly at odds with each other. They could be looking at the same data, but they are fundamentally interpreting it differently from each other. And we need to recognize that. And he actually uses it's a great word. He uses the word palingenesis. He says the palingenesis is key. Palingenesis is a Greek word. It just means born again. Yeah. So palin is Greek for again, and genesis is birth. And so you need the palingenesis of Christianity to actually see the world correctly. Yeah. And I think it's actually insightful. And he says what's ended up happening is when you recognize that in the field of science, that this is the war that's going on in science, then you can see that as a scientist, you're not just, this is just, raw data and it can mean anything. It's like, no, actually each scientist, whether if they're materialists, they're going to interpret it a certain way, or if they're spiritualists, they're going to interpret a certain way. And we need to recognize that it's not just neutral data that we're coming to. So that's key. The other thing he talks about with the science lecture is how the civil magistrate has actually overstepped its boundaries too far into the realm of science, such that you have all of these governments who are funding science programs, right? And Kuyper says, that's bad news. That's actually you're weighing the system a certain way. Yes. And he said actually, and what's ended up happening is the government is invested in it such that it's hampering research. Yeah. And it's not allowing scientists to actually explore where the data and the actual scientific method goes. And because Kuyper said if the government was stepped away, then we would actually have actual genuine debate between scientists, and they could actually debate the issues and actually work through the actual science
without fear of losing their funding.
Yeah, and we've seen some of that in 2020, and even now, it's 2021 as well, right? Where the government's weighing it a certain way, and it's like why are they invested in it? Why are they thinking this on this research? And there's a number of scientists who are actually disagreeing about the data, and this is science, right? Scientists need to disagree, and if they don't disagree and they can't argue through the material and the data, then it's unhelpful. You're not actually doing science,
right? And I just like that, because you're emphasizing just because you're an expert almost doesn't mean you're an expert, because in some ways you have to begin with a proper worldview and understanding of what God's sovereignty means for this area. Yeah. And so if you're going on being weighed improperly by the government, you're not actually doing it well and doing it right, even though you've got doctor next to your name. Yeah. It's so interesting. I think we'll save the full teaser for when people actually get and read the book. But there's a chapter on arts, which also seems like another, how do we think about arts in a Christianly way? So how is Calvin and Kuyper conceiving of that?
Yeah, Kuyper then, he's great. And Calvin actually spent a good deal talking about the arts. And the word arts is applying to all sorts of various artistic endeavors, not just necessarily like music, or we might think of like film or storytelling. I mean, Calvin would include that, but
Calvin had the best movies I've ever heard.
There you go. Yeah, but he's thinking more like pottery. He's thinking actual working with materials even as well. He's
blacksmithing.
Thinking, all those things. That's what he's talking about. So he's actually working with the as an artist, working with the skill of applying your skill to a particular medium then. And Calvin then recognizes, and he goes back to the Old Testament on that, thinking of the different saints of old who were inspired by the Holy Spirit to do different crafts. And you see that Spirit is actually poured on all sorts of people, not just particular people in Israel. It's gifts are given, even like in Genesis, you can see these people who are not necessarily Christian or even good, that they're interested in music and all these things. And it's like, okay, wow. And so Calvin says, well, actually these things are gifts, common gifts that God gives to everyone, and he blesses the whole world. It's like rain. Jesus talked about how God sends the rain on the just and the unjust, right? That art is a gift that God gives to everyone, and it's something good that's in the world. And then Kuyper takes that idea and he then applies with the thinking about common grace, where this is common, meaning it's applied to everyone, not that it's dirty or impure or something like that. It's just given to everybody. And it's a kind of grace, or we might just talk about it as a gift. It's a common gift to everyone, and that means then you can have a non-Christian creating good music, or you can have a non-Christian creating a good movie or a good story, because that's just a gift from the world that God has made, that they're enjoying and using that skill to create that story, or to create that pottery, or that whatever it is they're making.
Yeah, it's almost like they're subjected to the law of God, not specific 10 commandments, but just law and order that we see in creation, almost compelled by it to go and create something that's honoring to him.
Yeah. And then, I mean, and it's a great principle, and it actually has helped me understand things like, why do I appreciate this artist and he's not a Christian? Like, how is that possible?
Is that legal?
Is that okay to do that? And it's like,
something.
And then it gets even weirder and stranger in our day, for sure. But no, actually, we can recognize that as a good gift. Now, we need to recognize, though, and in our day, I think it's becoming more clear again, that there is the antithesis there, where while they are a non-Christian and God has been kind to them with this gift, I still think they can go off the road, and and they're using it in evil ways to promote secular agenda and sin, and we need to recognize that and watch out for that. And I remember there's actually one of the professors at NSA would talk about, New St. Andrews College, he would talk about how people will go to sometimes they go to rated R movies to go see the good things that are there. They'll talk about look, it's common grace, about how they understand evil and stuff. And and the professor said, that's kind of like trying to go bob for apples in a toilet, right? Where it's okay. No, actually, you recognize that this is actually a sinful, evil worldview that you're looking at, and it's just bad art. It's actually not good at all. Actually, and so I think Christians need to create good art, thoughtful art, not the cheesy, whatever Mennonite soap opera, Amish books, whatever they're out there, right?
Fireproof.
But but the actual, good, thoughtful stories, and it takes time, right? That's one of the things too. I mean, people have complained about Protestants. They're like, when have Protestants ever made any good art? They're terrible. It's like, well, what are you talking about? Like John Milton? You're talking about,
talking about Bach, or
Bach. I mean, what are you talking about? There's actually a number of artists, Lewis we can point to as well. And it's like, well, yeah, but those guys were 100 years ago. And it's like, well, actually, if you understand art actually takes time. Our art is not at the center of culture. Art is what flows out once you have the church and you have a body of Christians who actually are loving each other and obeying God like they're supposed to. Then, as a part of that final product, then you get the amazing art like Bach, right? I mean, Bach is a couple of generations or longer out from the Reformation, right? That recovery that Luther started, Bach is a direct result of that, but that's 100, 200 years down the road. I mean, so it doesn't happen overnight.
And art's always, it's always sort of orbiting, flowing. It's not necessarily in a way of technology in some ways. There's always something wonderful and beautiful to create. So I think fantastic book. Everyone needs to go read this book, because if you know these things, it's going to remind and take you to the source, put it all together, simple, digestible. And if all these things are new to you, you need to go learn them even more, because they're going to transform the way you live. So going off that idea, how do you think, you get it, you read it, then what would you encourage people to go do practically? Like, how should their lives be different now that are more acquainted with Kuyper?
Yeah, I think taking the things he's talking about and looking around to where God has called you, recognizing God's sovereignty in your life, and go, okay, what has God called me to do, and work there, and be faithful there. So if it's a mother, be a mother. If maybe a teacher, homeschooling at home, homeschool your kids at home, recognizing that these are these children are important gifts that God has given you, and that they need to understand the world. And then if you're a scientist, or if they can be thinking about how they're applying it to what they're doing there. Politicians get involved in civil government, but start where you are. Don't try and go too far. I mean, I think there's the great saying where everybody wants to save the world and nobody wants to help mom with the dishes.
Yeah.
Right? It's like no, help mom with the dishes. Right? That's a high calling as well. Work there, start there, and then when you're faithful with those little things, then you can be faithful with more, and actually can. And then God will bless you with more responsibilities then. So that's what I hope is from the book. See where you are, where God has called you, and then apply these things there right in front of you. And that's what Kuyper opens up, right? If you're an artist, be an artist, faithful to God, faithful to Jesus. If you're if you're in the church, be a Sunday school teacher and teach the kids there faithfully.
Yeah, and it seems like this will just spark and pop all those natural, simple, and common things that we do. So we can get this book on Amazon, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So just
search. So it's a paperback on Amazon, and then you can also get as a Kindle as well. It's a little cheaper as a Kindle.
Great. And is that the best place for people to go? Just
that's the best place.
Search it up on Amazon.
Yep. Yeah. So that's where it is, and it's a great to go there. Yep.
Great. Well, Jesse, thanks so much for joining me, and for all of you who tuned in, go get that book. We'll see you guys later.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was a fantastic interview. Just for you, those of you who are watching, I was behind the camera the entire time, puffing away on my pipe, thoroughly enjoying it. And I loved how he laid out sphere sovereignty, and we got to touch on all these topics, including the topic of art.
Okay.
But so you did your master's work on Calvin and art, particularly music, right? I'd actually love to have Jesse come back to talk about that a little more. But I really found myself wishing we had an hour to talk to him and just sick Sean on Jesse to really open up some of the stuff. Because in that book, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff where he just the greatest virtue of this book is just how simply, clearly, and quickly, to be honest, it lays out a lot of very fundamental concepts. You should read Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism, but the book, as an introduction, it just has so much virtue in itself, and it's a nice, easy read. Boom.
Boom, there it is. Read it.
But, when you're reading the chapter on art in Jesse's book, you definitely get a concise and I think quite accurate summation of Calvin and Kuyper's thoughts on art, and engaging with the idea of sacred art, how they tackled that, and really to help us refine our thinking. Yeah. Right. And where does art belong? What is art for? And you guys definitely touched on a lot of that stuff. But next time we're going to come get you again, Jesse. And we'll pursue that angle. But man, what a great interview.
And to Jesse's virtue, the reason someone can be concise and quick, is because
what a skill that is.
Because he knows it really well. Even when he's talking, I can just see the depths of information just in there as he's into his mind.
Everything
palace.
He's not telling you now.
I know.
It's
he knew there was part 2 coming.
So, there's definitely a lot of depth there. Anyway, go on.
Well, that's all I had to say. I'm just really glad he joined us. I'm glad he wrote that book. It's just it's one of those resources that you want as a Christian who is a friend to non-Christians or to Christians recently converted, so they're young in their faith, and you're like, hey, go read this. And there's nothing in that book that a new Christian couldn't handle. It'd be like, whoa, it'd be like groundbreaking for them, but it's a good recommender.
It is groundbreaking, but in a concise and in a very intelligible way. And, just this would require whole other episodes, but Calvinists are the Christians who are best equipped to deal in politics. Political theology. There's good political theology out there, and political theology of weight done by Christians who aren't Calvinists. Aquinas comes to mind. it always gets so muddy and difficult. But the way Calvin and subsequently Kuyper working off of him just were really able to be clear without drawing complicated diagrams like you and Jesse were talking about, right? But just where he says, this makes sense, and I see how this ought to work now, and I see where the authority here ought to be, or what the purpose of this thing is. Just such clarity. And so I think new Christians who are becoming Christians today are stepping into this chaotic world where mature Christians are struggling with the complexity of the situation. So honestly, as we proclaim the gospel and say Jesus is King, Calvinist thought has to be a part of that, really.
And even just having the context, we should be expecting a lot of converts in tumultuous times being shaken out. So you need to be ready when they come around your table.
A lot of our listeners' churches have been growing because they're the only churches that have stayed open.
Good for you.
Yeah.
So there's beauty and simplicity, and Jesse Sumpter did it well.
He's so beautiful.
So let's sign off.
Right. I was about to do the Joffrey the Giant, the peace of Christ be upon you sign off.
And let your name say it all this week. It's plow and potato.
Yeah, this is plow and potato. Keep your trowel in hand.
And keep your gun rather loose in the holster.